I do want to start with land acknowledgements. I know in the Canadian context, it gets it's overdone and gets a bad rep, but in the US context now that I've been away from Canada, in US, it's still a novel and a somewhat of a radical, rupturing, unsettling act to do that. As performative as it may be, as meaningless sometimes it gets, especially in the Canadian context. But in the US, I still find myself in many spaces, especially non-native spaces, where land is not acknowledged and the traditional keepers, land keepers and water keepers are not acknowledged. So I am zooming right now from Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute territories, what in settler imperial parlance is called Colorado. I'm in Denver and I've been here for the last 2 years. And I say that part of the land acknowledgement is to recognize the lands that I'm here, but also the lands that I'm zooming into in Toronto, and some of you might also not be in Toronto. So across North America, that we might, wherever we might be zooming in from, how settler colonialism is an ongoing process and hasn't ended. It's also to recognize all the things that we've witnessed in the Canadian settler state over the last year, especially with Mi'kmaq struggles for lobster, to the struggles in Caledonia, to everything that's happening with the pipelines in BC and Alberta, from movements like Shut Down Canada, Land Back, and braided warriors right now in BC who are facing a lot more escalated state violence in the last few days with the Trans Mountain pipelines. So just to that this talk is in context of that, and that it's as normative as it may be in an academic space to do that, it's still really important for me to ground myself from the lands that where I'm settled right now. And it's also too important to connect it with what we've been witnessing in the US and Canada and globally around the resurgence in Black liberation. And it's all these intersections between Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation to what I'll talk about, Kashmiri sovereignty in the South Asian context, how these struggles are entangled and linked in ways which we often don't pay attention to. And I'm hoping that my talk can highlight some of these entanglements and linkages that are important. It's also, it is a little strange to be back at York, and especially in this kind of space. It's been 5 years that I left York, and I've had in the 5 years moved 3 times and have had 3 different academic positions, and we've all gone through a year of the pandemic. So in all this context, it is strange. I do miss York a lot of times, and York is a very special kind of mess that I've realized in the last 5 years that I've been away, that York can produce a lot of things, a lot of amazing things, but also a lot of messy things that we all know, all of us who navigate York or have navigated York in the past. Right. I also want to just give a quick shout out to Shobna and Bonita, who were on my dissertation committee, and it's so good to see both of them here. And in the 5 years that I've been away, so much of my work that I was trying to finish my manuscript and turn my dissertation into a manuscript, that their support and guidance, mentorship while I was in the process at York and since then has been phenomenal. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Shobna and Bonita as well. I'm just gonna share my screen. Just give me a sec. I feel like I can spend the whole time just giving my thanks and shout outs to everyone. I can't seem to open my PowerPoint.
Well, while Nishant is working through their, PowerPoint, I just realized that for all the people who aren't at York, I should actually have done this anyway, but I should introduce Nishant. So just a quick brief introduction before Nishant can take it away. Nishant is an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. They received their PhD at York. Their dissertation received the National Women's Studies Association University of Illinois Press first book award in 2018. Prior to joining CU Boulder, Nishant taught women's and gender studies at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and Northern Arizona University. Their book manuscript, Indians on Indian Lands, Transnational Intersections of Race, Caste, and Indigeneity, studies the formation of dominant caste Hindu Indian diasporas in North America and Indian diasporic complicities in processes of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, anti-blackness, heteronormativity, and brahminical supremacy. The manuscript is under advanced contract with the University of Illinois Press. Their scholarship has been published in Cultural Studies, Interventions, Feminist Studies, Journal of Critical Ethnic Studies, and several other anthologies and online spaces. Thanks, Nishant.
Thanks. Okay, so my slides are on. In my last shout out, I had planned so many, but I'm just gonna skip. I just want to give out a shout out to everyone at York, my main group of people that I survived York through a South Asian research group. That I see Harshita is here, and I can't see names right now who else is here. But all the things that we did over years at York, with all the support from Alicia and YCAR, to create a space for South Asian studies, to thinking about what Vedant was saying in terms of creating these transnational conversations within the Canadian academic context. So just wanted to give a shout out to I found these posters earlier today, things that we did in 2016, 2015, and prior to that. As Vedant said, I'm working on my manuscript right now, Indians on Indian Lands, which draws from my dissertation work, where I'm trying to understand what does it mean for dominant caste Indian Hindus to be on Indigenous lands in the Canadian context, and how are they settler complicities formulated through the intersections of race, caste, and indigeneity. In today's talk, I'll specifically think about thinking through caste and its relationship to indigeneity in North American context and South Asian context, and that how caste is then mobilized from everyday encounters between Indian diasporic folks in Canada with Indigenous communities, but also how caste becomes a really key analytic to understand the rampant mobilization of Hindu right-wing Hindutva organizing in North America in relationship to what's happening in India and Kashmir. Right. So my other parts of the book project think through more questions about anti-blackness, things about racialized labor formations and extraction sites in BC and Alberta. Where I specifically look in BC, look at 70s and 80s migration of South Asians, mostly Punjabis and Sikhs, who are working in extraction industries like the lumber mills and fisheries. And then I juxtapose it with looking at Indian engineers at the tar sands in the last 10 years. And so I'll focus more on my work with Indian engineers on tar sands. But this is in conversation with the work that I've been trying to do, thinking through questions of differences in class and caste and religion in the making of South Asian or Punjabi Sikh diasporas in BC versus dominant caste Hindu diasporas in Alberta. And then I look through questions of gender and sexuality as well in the larger project, and think through what it means to be in solidarity when we say we are in solidarity as Indians, but South Asians as well, largely to thinking about what it means to be in a settler context, and then to play along with the formation of the settler state. So, so I'm gonna start now. Okay, so in June 2015, then BC Premier Christy Clark announced the celebration of International Yoga Day, IWD, on Burrard Bridge, Vancouver. Clark invited yogis from all over BC on June 21st to, quote, roll out their mats, practice their favorite pose. The $150,000 event on the bridge, sponsored by multinational corporations like Lululemon Athletica, YY Yoga, and Altagas, would have closed down the bridge for traffic for 7 hours. It was intended to be the largest International Yoga Day celebration outside of India. And for those of you who are familiar with all the different tactics that Modi uses to globalize all things Indian as Hindu, International Yoga Day was Day of Yoga has been a very critical tool that Modi has relied on to spread its Hindutva agenda in the global north. The Vancouver event generated much protest against itself. One of the main reasons behind the protest was the perceived disrespect for National Aboriginal Day. June 21st has been celebrated as National Aboriginal Day by Indigenous peoples in Canada since 1996. While the event was eventually cancelled amid protest, I argue that the cancelled event unravels complex intricacies between processes that are often invisibilized within the Canadian multicultural settler framework and deemed disconnected and isolated. It demonstrates links between the settler state's amnesia about its continued existence, continued colonial existence, white multicultural neoliberal appropriation of yoga, and processes of brahminical supremacy that shape Indian diasporas in Canada. Brahminical supremacy is a structure, a process that dictates and shapes all kinds of caste hierarchies and violences in India and the Indian diasporas. Through this paper, I'll try to unmap how those different formations happen. But in the Q&A, if we have time, I'm happy to talk more about those intersections. So social, cultural, economic processes in the diaspora have changed caste formations, but not dismantled them. Homogeneous constructs of Indianness in North America are used to mask dominant caste Indian Hindu hegemony. Yoga as an iconic signifier of India, South Asia, Hinduism, and brown bodies highlights how certain markers of Indianness have social, cultural, and economic ascendancy over markers of indigeneity within the multicultural states. The appropriated, consumed, and celebrated Indianness in Canada is rooted in Brahminical Indianness. This South Asian subject is dominant caste, upwardly mobile Hindu Indian who aspires to whiteness and settlerness by disassociating themselves with the other others, which includes Indigenous, Black, and caste others. Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird contends, quote, colonialism brought the world, its people, and their own structures of power and hegemony to Indigenous lands, end of quote. Building on Bird, I argue that while anti-native racism has its own genealogies in white settler societies, grammars of anti-native racism function in relation to other technologies and geographies of difference-making and oppression. In the context of the Indian diaspora in North America, these transnational logics of power and othering are rooted in Brahminical supremacy. Thenmuri Sundarajan and Sintajan Vartaraja call to South Asian diasporas, quote, every issue that we might want to understand better and address, whether it's Indigenous rights of the First Nations, Aboriginal populations, or Native Americans, misogyny, racism, feminism, labor right, immigration issue, anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, transphobia, or Hindu fundamentalism will not be possible if caste is not dismantled. Thus, while caste is not an obvious factor in analysis of settler colonialism, I argue that any understanding of Indian diasporas is incomplete without addressing and critiquing Brahminical supremacy. And these intersections have become a lot more visible in the last few years under Modi's and Trump's regimes in the US and India, and how transnational collaborations have been happening within these fascist regimes. And with India's escalation and intensification of settler colonial project in Kashmir, I think it's really become really more apparent and clear that we need to address how whiteness and Brahminical supremacy work in making these transnational settler colonial projects in North America, from North America to Hawaii to Palestine to India and Kashmir. So in today's talk, I'm going to demonstrate how caste shapes Indian diasporic complicities, from everyday othering in the tar sands by Indian diasporic people, diaspora, to Hindutva organizing across Canada and US, and to settler colonial processes in Kashmir. I navigate through these varying spatial and colonial frames from the macro to the micro to illustrate the centrality of Brahminical supremacy in transnational settler colonial processes. I'll begin theoretically outlining, actually I'm going to skip the theoretical framework since I spend a lot more time on things. Thank you. So I'm just going to skip that, and I'm going to start talking about my work in Fort McMurray, where I interviewed Indian engineers 5-6 years ago at this point. And I'm going to start with sharing a field note from one of my engagements in Fort McMurray. After requesting an appointment with Ashish multiple times, I was finally given an appointment at his house. Ashish, as I was reminded several times by the friend who introduced us, worked at a senior manager level in an oil company. His wife Ragni also worked at a manager level in the same company. My friend told me several times to respect Ashish and Ragni's time and to keep my interview brief, non-controversial, and apolitical. When I arrived at the decided time, Ashish was not ready for the interview. I was seated in the living room by his mother-in-law. He arrived 25 minutes later. As he was going through his emails on his BlackBerry, barely interested or intrigued by my presence, I was told that I only had 20 minutes to talk to him, whereas we had decided for a conversation for at least an hour. That night, I was told by Ashish that Paresh Rawal, a major Bollywood star, was in town. The Indian community had spent a hefty amount in getting Rawal to Fort McMurray. Rawal at that time in 2013 had just declared that he was going to run for federal elections in India on the next year with the ticket with the BJP, which is Modi's fascist government. Rawal had garnered much support within the conservative Hindu diaspora in Canada and US. This was just before 2014 when Modi came into power for the first time, and already illustrates how organized the Hindu diaspora was getting around Modi and Hindutva ideology, even in spaces like Fort McMurray, which are far, far away from our imaginations of where diaspora, especially Indian diasporas, are in North America. Ashi started asking me this regular Desi uncle, Indian uncle questions to figure out my social positioning. Knowing very well that his intentions were to know my caste background, I dodged his questions about my last name and family background a few times. But I finally caved into his questions to get the conversation started. Immediately, he recognized me as a Brahmin from his region. Caste and regional affinity changed his attitudes towards me. All of a sudden, I was introduced to his wife and his mother-in-law as Kharwale, someone from the family. I was offered chai with namkeen and a privilege to interview them for over an hour, going much beyond the 20 minutes he had allocated. All this happened because of our shared caste and regional backgrounds. My caste was a way into his world, our shared caste world. This exchange demonstrates the modalities of caste, class, and assumed gender, and how they shape diasporic relations to maintain caste and kin hierarchies. That I was able to talk to him because of my caste further illustrates how caste is intrinsically connected to knowledge production in the Indian diaspora. Indians I spoke to, in fact, Fort McMurray were primarily first generation, dominant caste, upwardly mobile, educated, and skilled Indian Hindus from across different urban centers in India. They're all cisgender in heteronormative marriages, presumably endogamic. All interviews were conducted in English, but my participants spoke a wide range of languages, including Gujarati, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, and Punjabi. And at that time, everyone was either a naturalized Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. It is by no means coincidental that all my respondents had a dominant caste background. In Fort McMurray, the social and professional circles I was privy to were constructed to shared dominant caste Hindu backgrounds. That my primary contact in Fort McMurray was a childhood friend from Delhi who happens to be Brahmin is not happenstance. Our shared urban middle class upbringing in India had lots to do with caste. My friend and his wife, both in a heteronormative endogamous arranged marriage, were my prime leads. They introduced me to their social and professional circles, and it was through their caste networks that I was able to do my field work in Fort McMurray. Even if most of the respondents did not mention their caste backgrounds openly to me, it was assumed that I was one of them as I was referred to them by my friend. Some respondents did openly talk about their caste backgrounds, how important it was for them to maintain certain circles, that is, their Hindu caste circles. In my interactions with them, it was clear that as a dominant caste assumed cis heterosexual man, a PhD student, I was allowed to be privy to their lives and their indulgence in letting me interview them for the benefit of my education. Caste affinities guarantee privileges which may not have been easily given if my caste was not readily recognizable. In my conversations in the field, I observed how race, caste, and indigeneity are conflated to construct the other by dominant caste Hindu Indians. In other words, my respondents understood and constructed indigeneity through an assemblage of others, which included the Dalit and the Adivasi other. Through the construction of dominant caste self, the other others are rendered interchangeable, homogeneous, and disposable. It creates, albeit contradictory, seamless binaries of progress versus backwardness, modernity versus traditionalism, merit versus state dependency. Through my conversations, I traced 4 discursive techniques that my respondents deployed in talking about indigeneity, racism, and Canada in general, where they relied upon notions of caste and indigeneity from India. Before exploring these logics of othering, I should note that dominant caste subject does not recognize the native other as the caste other instantly. Rather, as Punita Lawrence had pointed out to me in a conversation years ago, that this happens through the mediation of the settler state. By investments and inclusion in the Canadian settler state, the racialized dominant caste subject learns who the native is through the state's sanctioned colonial discourses. By recognizing the caste other in the native other, the dominant caste migrant can ascertain their positionality and privilege in the settler society. This is how structures of brahminical caste supremacy and settler colonialism come into contact with each other. My respondents often relied on notions of indigeneity in India to talk about indigeneity in Canada, thereby equating Adivasi and tribal peoples to indigenous peoples in Canada. The main connected thread invariably was their the idea that they're backward. Constructing linear binaries of modernity versus tradition, my respondents othered all indigenous peoples as backward, uncivilized, and always already outside of modernity. For instance, when I asked Munish, a chemical engineer in Fort McMurray, on what he felt about both communities being called Indian, both as in Indians from India and indigenous peoples in the Americas called Indian, he responded, quote, "It's just a terminology, probably. It does not really matter. The thing is that they tend to be more attached to nature, which we were also at some point of time. They're just like the Adivasis we have in India. They lead their lives with the basic." End of quote. For Manish and other respondents, the indigenous other in Canada is a stranger they recognize via the Adivasi and the tribal other in India. Logics of assumed uncivilizedness and outside of modernity are universal tropes used for indigenous peoples alike in India and Canada alike. Through this transnational construct, the dominant caste racialized subject can then be the preferred Indian over all Indian others in Canada and in the Indian context. Racial differences between the self and the indigenous other here or there are also constructed through the lens of culture, following the model minority tropes and self-orientalizing discourses about strong cultural values. Most respondents in Fort McMurray reflected on their superior values with a sense of pride. For Ashish and Ragni, who I mentioned earlier, Indians got independence from the British Raj because of these values and culture, whereas indigenous cultures were not strong enough to resist the colonizer. The imagined cultural superiority is always a code for caste. Sadhu Binning, a poet, an author, and a community activist based out on Vancouver, elaborates on this further. According to him, quote, "The Punjabi and Indian community came largely from a society where there was hierarchy of the caste system, and most people who came here were from the class that owned land. They feel they're above everybody else. If you talk to them, they did not really respect the native peoples in general. They see them as the media projects them as drunk people." End of quote. Indian diaspora in the Australian settler state, Amit Sarwal notes, also similarly looks down upon Aborigines due to their different class, caste, and racial positionalities. According to him, quote, "Even if caste as an institution cannot be practiced publicly or caste consciousness has not survived, this consciousness has subtly merged into class. In fact, class, caste, and race are so intertwined among Indian Australians that this logic is used to condescendingly look down upon Aborigines and other immigrants." End of quote. Upwardly mobile Indians often migrate to North America, Europe, and other global North states, feeling demotivated and discriminated against because of state reservation, that is, the positive affirmation policies in education and public sector jobs targeted towards Dalit, Adivasis, and Bahujan communities. In principle, these communities seek to undo the injustices that these caste oppressed communities face, historical and ongoing. While benefits of these policies to these communities in the face of oppression that they face are debatable, dominant caste people view them as anti-dominant caste Hindu policies. For many people from privileged backgrounds, this is one of the prime reasons they migrate out of India, often labeled as the brain drain in popular discourses. In my conversations with Indians in Fort McMurray, many of them brought up caste as a barrier back home for good education and good opportunities, job opportunities. Further, these policies are always imagined as anti-merit. Discourses of merit are mobilized by dominant caste communities to ascertain their privileged position in India. However, abstract notions of merit are rendered as individual traits rather than a historical accumulation of caste privileges and capital. Ajanta Subramaniam notes that these claims to merit generate a newly consolidated form of upper casteness that become the basis for capitalist accumulation and transnational aspirations and mobility. This mobility first justifies the flight away from lower caste politics in India, and second plays into the model minority myths, which becomes both casteless and raceless. While these are familiar discourses, the open prejudice, anger, and frustrations toward caste-oppressed communities is still very revealing. Even without provocation, the willingness to share their bias and casted outlooks illustrates how rampant casteism is within Indian Hindu diasporic communities and how integral it is to their claims of model citizenship in the settler state of Canada. These anti-reservation and imagined victimhood conversations were curiously juxtaposed with welfare state mechanisms in Canada. One of the major anti-Indigenous perceptions brought up by my respondents was how Indigenous peoples are monetarily dependent on the Canadian state through subsidies, tax cuts, allowances, etc. This following extended quote from a respondent reveals this sense of injustice that many in the Indian diaspora feel. Kritika, who works in a bank in Fort McMurray, commented, quote, "They don't have to pay taxes. They live in the reserves. I've seen many women who just get pregnant and then get their child benefits. The government does not gives them some kind of bonus every 6 months, I think. That's a huge amount, sometimes $6,000 to $10,000. That's free money for them, and they don't even have to pay taxes on it. And that's how they live. Being in Fort Mac, where everyone else is being taxed at a very high rate, these people walk in with no taxes or anything. I feel very frustrated. Why do we have to pay taxes so high and they just do nothing? End of quote. This quote from Kritika elaborates on the perversity of state-produced and state-sanctioned discourses about Indigenous peoples. While Kritika claims this knowledge through her experiences in the bank, it is not hard to challenge the policies she produces. By exaggerated tales and numbers, she passionately illustrates the perceived injustices in the system. Needless to say, these are the same kinds of injustices and positive affirmation policies for Dalit, Adivasi, tribal, and Bahujan communities in India that made her move to Canada. She's quick to highlight how, as a hard and educated worker, she faces discrimination in terms of high taxes in Fort McMurray. I argue that it is critical to situate perceived notions of quote-unquote welfare Indians within the context of settler colonial state, but also to contextualize how dominant caste diasporic Indians view themselves as victims at the hands of reservation and positive affirmation policies, both in Canada and India, and then render all caste and Indigenous others as the unmodeled others. So from Fort McMurray, I'm going to travel to York University and come back to the questions of appropriations of yoga, a cause that is dear to right-wing as well as liberal Hindu Indians, and unfortunately many in the progressive diaspora as well. Through articulations of yoga as an Indigenous practice, I trace how Hindutva organizing in Canada and North America, and how indigeneity and Hinduphobia is invoked to maintain Indian occupation of Kashmir and to make simultaneous contradictory claims to solidarity with Indigenous peoples in North America, as well as settler claims to these colonized lands. Coming to York, I'm going to talk about the scholar Ragini Sharma, who's a PhD alum from York University, who in her scholarship seeks to decolonize yoga from an Indigenous, decolonial, and post-colonial scholarship. She theorizes yoga as an Indigenous knowledge, which has been colonized through British colonialism and contemporary appropriation of yoga in North America. She argues that yoga should be considered, quote, in the context of history of colonization and attempted cultural genocide of Indigenous knowledges all over the world, end of quote. Needless to say, she's Brahmin and a Hindutva ideologue. She writes further, quote, as an Indian immigrant living in Canada, I could relate to racism experienced by Indigenous peoples of Canada. This Indigenous approach to land reminded me about the similar approach taken by Hindus to their Indigenous knowledge of yoga, Ayurveda, and numerous philosophy. Asking every non-Indigenous person living on colonized lands to reflect on the fact that they're situated on Indigenous lands serves to prevent historical amnesia of the history of colonization. Similarly, there is historical amnesia, intended or unintended, in many ideas in Western psychology and philosophy that are rooted in yoga and related knowledges from India, end of quote. So she claims Hindus are Indigenous people who've been colonized by Europe for centuries, and their knowledges have been appropriated, misunderstood, and discredited because of what she calls Euro-American Hinduphobia. Arguing that pre-colonial India was, quote, a land of milk and honey, she makes no references to brahminical supremacy and caste structures in pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial India. In fact, supporting the Modi regime's campaigns like the International Yoga Day, she sees no violence in the overtly and drastic fascist, brahminical, and Islamophobic turns that the Indian state has taken in the last few years. Sharma attempts to decolonize yoga using Indigenous and decolonial scholarships to illustrate how the Hindu right creatively and unabashedly deploys and appropriates Indigenous and other progressive discourses towards its own fascist agendas. In her work, Sharma pivots writers like Rajiv Malhotra as a quote-unquote decolonial scholar, along with the other decolonial scholars like Linda Smith, Alfred Dayake, Edward Said, Franz Fanon, and others. She uses Malhotra's diatribes to decolonize Indology and rectify the wrongs done by white and Western-trained, non-practicing Hindu scholars. So some of you might be really familiar with who Rajiv Malhotra and others not. So just to give a glimpse of who he is an author. He's many, many things, and I can spend the next 40 minutes just talking about him, but I'm just going to briefly share the names of the books that he's authored in the last few years, or 10 years maybe. These titles include like Academic Hinduphobia, The Battle for Sanskrit, Being Different, and Indian Challenge to Western Universalism. He founded the Infinity Foundation in 1994 and Educational Council for Indic Traditions in 2000. The Infinity Foundation has given over 400 grants to several universities for Indic studies programs, such as Harvard University, Rutgers, Columbia, University of Penn, etc. And again, some of you might be familiar with what index studies is, but to keep a glimpse or short for those of you who are not familiar, what index studies is. So my previous institution, University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, has a center called a Center for Index Studies. When I first started, I assumed index studies refers to Indology. Indology is this colonial oriental study of India, more specifically Sanskrit and Hinduism, and the precursor to the Cold War era Indian studies in Canada and the US. However, index studies is much more recent and positions itself as a critique of Indology and India studies. The field has been reclaimed, as these scholars claim, by dominant caste Indian Hindus who are not necessarily social science and humanities scholars by training, and they refer to the study of India as only understood as Hindu civilization. These scholars maintain that the study of India has been shaped by Eurocentric, racist, and colonial epistemologies, including Indian scholars in fields such as post-colonial theory, feminism, Marxism, who are all seen as the stooges of the Western Academy. They argue that this scholarship has been biased and negative towards India and Indian civilization, as both non-Indians and non-practicing Hindus dominate these fields. Khosla Wepa from Index Studies Foundation, San Francisco claims, quote, "We've been perplexed how, on the one hand, great attention is paid to ensure that India is not accepted within the first ranks of countries by virtue of her size, geography, civilizational reach, and even economic and military power, while at the same time they maintain with monotonous regularity that India is an inconsequential third world country with nothing of lasting value emerging from Indic civilization." I should note that what they call Indic civilization is the Harappa civilization, which is in present-day Pakistan and has historically no connections between what is claimed to be Hindu or Vedic civilizations. Thus, Indic studies seeks to produce decolonized knowledges that glorify India and to regain its true grandeur. With these grand missions, the first major Indic studies unit in the US was started in Columbia in 1995. Since then, there have been several other institutions, both inside and outside the academy in the US, including the one at my previous institution in 2001. Many of these academic units and players, players like Malhotra, along with Hindu American Foundation, which is here on the slide, have been campaigning to change representation of Hinduism and Hindus in California textbooks, California K-12 textbooks since 2005. They claim representations of Hinduism in the textbooks are negative, biased, and Hinduphobic, and that Hindu students face bullying and racism because of these textbooks. The so-called anti-Hinduism bias is how these books talked about actually in the past, caste, gender, and religious violence in India. So for them, naming these caste, religious, and gender violences is a form of Hinduphobia. In 2017, they won a fierce campaign led by South Asian, against the fierce campaign organized by South Asian Histories for All. This attack on the textbook to portray Hinduism in a positive light is a global strategy used by Hindutva forces to underplay historical and ongoing caste apartheid and Islamophobia in India. Erasing Caste, Chinaya Jangam argues, quote, reflects an interesting anxiety on of the caste Hindu diaspora surrounding its own identity as well as its own history and culture. So even as Indic studies claims to challenge racism in the American Academy, they benefit from what I argue their caste positionalities, their settler proximities, and to aspirations to whiteness. However, in their attempts to claim proximity to whiteness, these organizations are also increasingly invested in claiming a solidarity with indigenous communities on Turtle Island. So curiously, at the peak of Standing Rock mobilization that we saw in 2016, a lot of these Hindu organizations came out in solidarity with indigenous peoples. I'm just going to leave these quotes here for a few minutes so folks can read these, where they made it a statement around how Hindu and indigenous peoples have similar struggles against colonialism, and that's why Hindus in North America need to show up for folks at Standing Rock in 2016. So needless to say, these solidarity narratives are not only appropriating indigenous struggles, but also actively complicit in colonization of
Nishant, could you slow down a bit, please?
Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just, yeah, it's the old habit a lot of you know. So needless to say, these solidarities are not only appropriating indigenous struggles, but also that their presence as Hindu right-wing organizations is also deeply complicit in ongoing colonization in the US and Turtle Island. Further taking clues from Zionist voices in their mobilization for continued occupation of Palestine, these Hindutva organizations are also mobilizing Hindu victimhood from Kashmir to Pakistan to North America and seeking to ally themselves with Zionist forces at the same time with native struggles. I should also note that these organizations also came out with solidarity with the resurgence in struggles for Black liberation last summer, and how they think as Hindus they need to be out in solidarity with Black folks without ever naming caste and caste hierarchies and violences and apartheid in the US, Canada, and in India. The plight of Kashmiri Hindus as indigenous to Kashmir is the central to the myth making of Hinduphobia and continued colonization of Kashmir by the Indian state. Kashmiri Pandit exodus is often framed as a displacement of indigenous peoples. In their indigenous claims to the lands in Kashmir, Kashmiri Pandits erase Kashmiri Muslim belonging and claims to land to Kashmir. For instance, in Prasenjit Kumar's 2017 novel, You Can't Kill My Love, a Kashmiri Holocaust love story, a story of romance between two Kashmiri Pandits, quote, whose lives are torn asunder by Islamic terrorists, the protagonist Sanjay Tiku narrates this, quote, that way we are quite like the Native Americans, till Columbus and his descendants drove them to small reservations. But there is one more and very important difference. Unlike Native Americans, our ancestors were not warriors. In fact, they were intellectuals, quite like the Jews of Europe. They were priests, advisors to king, philosophers, and historians. My ancestors started suffering persecution only when Muslim invaders came to Kashmir some 600 years ago. So through twisted logics, Kashmiri Hindus are then both akin to indigenous peoples as well as Jewish people. And then both these articulations are framed through Islamophobic logics, right? Organizations like the Hindu American Foundation and Hindu Human Rights all work with groups like Indo-American Kashmir Forum, who, amongst other things, lobbies with the US government about the plight of Kashmiri Pandits, quote, the persecution, exile, and annihilation of Kashmir's one vibrant Hindu community. These lobbies have actively been organizing in the US since the cease to silence cease in 2019, to silence any critiques of the Indian occupation. One of the prime examples of this was prior to 2019 and 2016, President Trump's presidential campaign, where Republican Hindu Coalition for Trump organized an event in New Jersey, where Trump famously said, "I'm a big fan of the Hindu." The event was touted as a mega Bollywood fundraising event in the US for the victims of terror in America and around the world. The proceeds, however, went to Kashmiri Pandit organizations in India and North America. The event featured a Bollywood-style skit about two dancing heterosexual couples, presumably Hindu, kidnapped by terrorists, presumably Muslims, and rescued by US soldiers, presumably white. The skit ended with the music switched to Born in the USA as performers and danced enthusiastically with US flags. In 2018, the same Republican Hindu Coalition organized in support of Trump for his merit-based immigration change in policies, his anti-DACA policies, and the wall, where they actually said that we will, if you give us more visas, we will fund the wall for you. And the Hindus will fund the wall for Trump. These groups are not just in alliance with the Republicans, but Democrats as well. Many of these groups have been linked to at least 3 of the Democratic presidential 2020 campaign, from Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Buttigieg, and Joe Biden. Moreover, when Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden made statements critiquing the Indian state and the situation, quote-unquote, situation in Kashmir, both came under fierce attack from Hindu American lobbies for making anti-India and anti-Hindu statements. These attacks are not trivial, as in November 2019 UK elections, Hindu groups lobbied massively within Indian communities against the Labour Party for making similar remarks on Kashmir. So while caste relations and hierarchies cannot be fully realized within North American societies, through this paper I've sought to illustrate how the racialized dominant caste subject seeks to maintain and reproduce their caste and settler privileges. The self and the communal sense of supremacy has been key to the expansion of fascist Hindutva organizing in Indian diasporas. In this talk, I've traveled between Canada, US, India, and Kashmir to demonstrate how caste shapes not just transnational fascism, but also transnational settlerness as well. From everyday casted and settler discourses to Hindutva organizing, I sought to unmask the centrality of caste in the making of Indian diaspora and the settler colonial projects of Canada, India, and US. However, by focusing on the right, I do not intend to limit the discussion of caste and settlerness within the realms of right-wing politics only, as when it comes to maintenance of caste and settler structures, dominant caste Indian Hindus have been complicit across the political spectrum. B.R. Ambedkar noted almost a century ago, quote, "Is it reasonable to expect that the Brahmins will ever consent to lead a movement, the ultimate result of which is to destroy the power and prestige of the Brahmin caste? Is it reasonable to expect the secular Brahmins to take part in a movement directed against the priestly Brahmins? In my judgment," Ambedkar said, "it is useless to make distinction between the secular Brahmins and priestly Brahmins. Both are kith and kin. They're both the same body. One is bound to fight for the existence of the other." So taking cues from Ambedkar's theorization, I argue it is critical to understand settler and caste complicities across the political spectrum in India and the diaspora, including the Indian diasporic left in North America. So in the larger book project, I engage with dominant caste Indian post-colonial and transnational feminists like Nandita Sharma, many of you know who she is, and others like Kiran Asher and Ashwini Dambe, on their anti-Indigenous scholarships. I argue that in their rejection of Indigenous sovereignty, using the guise of post-colonial theoretical frameworks, they expose their own dominant caste positionalities. And I can talk more about this in the question and answer round. And just to conclude, I don't have a formal conclusion, but I thought I'll just say what I usually do, how I usually conclude my talks in the US in the last few years, is to talk about how different South Asian communities in Toronto show up for Indigenous folks, from Sikhs, Kashmiris, Tamils, and Tibetans, and how these grounded acts of solidarity are rare in the US context because of how settler colonialism works and how native sovereignty is disavowed consistently in progressive spaces and left spaces in the US, right? So all to say, I continue to take inspiration from ways Indigenous, Black, and South Asian and other communities continue to organize together in places like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and across Canada for decolonial futures for all. So thank you.